Dan, thank you so much for joining my podcast today. I'm so excited to talk about your new book, Crushing Doubt. I read it and I was fascinated, and I knew I was going to be fascinated because it's not only for mind-body symptoms, at least to me, it's a landmark in the self-improvement because it talks about relationships, boundaries, our relationships with ourselves, and what we are here to do, our purpose in life. So thank you for that work. And please tell me about, and the viewers, about your story with back pain and how did you start this journey?
Well, first of all, thank you for reading the book and for saying the things that you said about it. It means a lot that it came across that way because the book really isn't just about reducing symptoms, but it started off that way. So, I often share with people why I do the work that I do. It comes from the suffering that I experienced and what I wished had been out there, as well as what I've learned from it. So I'll start with what I'll say is the beginning of the book anyway, though it goes further back than that. So when I was 28 years old, I bent over to tie my shoelaces, and I felt a little twinge in my back. And I thought, okay, well, no big deal. But another part of me thought, well, wait a minute. What about those people who say they have a back problem? And I started thinking, what if? And, the more powerful your imagination, the worse these things can be, actually. Imagination is a great thing, but sometimes not. And, I started to worry about it. And then I started noticing that movements were becoming harder. It was starting to become sore. And this was all happening in the span of a couple of days. Within a couple of days, I was experiencing violent back spasms multiple times a day, including at night. I was like, something is really wrong.
Right. And how old were you at the time?
I was 28 years old.
Active and working out and everything?
Yeah. I mean, I was playing basketball all the time. At the time, I was lifting weights, so that's not something I do now. Not because I'm worried about it, but actually because I'm not so interested in doing it. I do other exercises for strength.
Yeah.
But I was a very active person. I was always like a sports-oriented person. And so suddenly I'm in this totally different place, and I'm trying to figure out what is happening. What is happening to me? Now, meanwhile, this will not surprise you because you've read the book, Osam, and maybe we had talked about it before, but when I was a baby, my father passed away when he was 29 years old. So here I am, 28, and I'm like, this is weird. Why is this happening right then? And even then, I thought, well, this seems like it can't be fully a coincidence. But I couldn't wrap my head around it because it was so physical, and it hurt so badly. So I was like, well, this can't be about my dad. I mean, this is like, there's something wrong with my back. So eventually I went to a doctor, as people tend to do in situations where there's a physical problem. And I was utterly shocked at what I found there. They basically said, yeah, we see this kind of thing all the time, and there's not much you can do about it. And I was like, what? Excuse me? I was used to doctors at least being interested in solving the problem, but it seemed like I had this weird problem, and I couldn't understand why, that they weren't going to be able to resolve. So they gave me a referral to physical therapy. But this is a referral coming from a doctor who tells me there's not much you can do about it. I remember I even asked her, I was like, am I going to have this for the rest of my life? And she said, probably. And I was like, I don't know what's happening here, but I was already suffering hugely physically, but this was...
Yeah. Talk about bedside manners.
No, seriously. It's a increasingly lost art, but hopefully we're regaining it now that we're thinking about these things more. So I was already suffering a lot physically, but this was adding a major psychological component. I felt alone. I felt afraid. I felt confused. I felt like there were no answers. And so then they sent me to physical therapy, and I was like, well, this is a recommendation from you who thinks I can't do anything. Like, what? How's this going to work? I got to the physical therapist. He was more upbeat about it, but in the end, he also had no answers. He was like, I don't know why it's not responding to the usual exercises. So there was a whole lot of I don't know. And so I basically just, I gave up for a while. I was like, okay, I guess this is the way it is. And then I kind of got back on my feet at some point and said, well, I got to try something. And I remember I was talking to a work colleague, and she said that she had back pain. And I heard that past tense. I was like, had back pain? What is this?
Right.
And she said she went to a chiropractor. I said, fine, I'll try anything. So I went to a chiropractor, went through all sorts of exercises, the adjustments. It hurt a lot, but eventually it started helping some, but I had no idea why. Still had no idea why. It wasn't until 8 years in, 8 years of, and I had this every single day, every single second. The
Right.
only relief I would ever have is if I took some Advil for a couple of hours, and it wasn't full relief. It just was better.
Right. And I heard you describe it in one of the videos. It was like you would say it's like a rusty nail in my back, something very specific.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was one area that felt like the rusty nail, and then there was another area that I described as the eel muscle, and it was like it would like electrify and shift all around. And that was two of the problems. The other problem was I had this immense tightness and soreness. Like it felt like I had just gone like 15 rounds with Muhammad Ali. I mean,
Yeah.
I was in bad shape.
How did it affect your lifestyle?
It dominated everything. I mean, for that 8 years, every second of every day, I'd wake up thinking about my back. I'd fall asleep thinking about my back. And then during the day, I'd be thinking, what do I need to do for my back? What kind of chair do I need to sit in? Do I need to get a new bed? How do I get up from the chair after seeing patients? Because I was already a therapist at this time, without, having a spasm or showing them I was having a problem. How do I explain this to people? It dominated everything. I didn't play basketball for 8 years. I used to play basketball all the time. I'm back to playing basketball, full court, twice a week. It's great.
Yeah.
But it dominated everything.
Right. Right. Wow. So the book Crushing Doubt, you share in it the advanced system, column system of the emotion, the doubt, and the power. What was your journey of developing that system? Because to me, it's so concise. It just puts my mind at ease knowing that there's a system. And I wonder to myself, like, how did people or psychologists think about psychology before that? Because if there's no system, it becomes so open and wide and there's no parameters for it.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you about how the system developed, how it came to be, and then we can talk about kind of its implications and how it changes how I think about all kinds of things, including therapy. So the first thing is 8 years into this suffering experience, I was still working with the chiropractor for many, many years, kind of trying to keep it at bay as much as possible and holding on to whatever explanations he could give me about it, but never feeling really great about it. And then one day he mentioned to me, well, there is this book that you could read that some people get some things out of. And he said, he takes it too far, but you should read it.
Yeah.
So I got this book. It was by a guy named Dr. John Sarno. Sarno is probably my greatest hero of all time, other than like Paul McCartney and the Beatles. But
Yeah.
but this guy saved my life, like personally. And it's not that I went to visit him. I got it all from the information in the book. About 3 pages in, I was like, oh my God, this explains it. And so I wasn't getting all of the answers right away, but I had much more answers right away. Because what he described is that all of these structural diagnoses that people talk about, they're not what's causing the pain. They don't even correlate with the pain. Herniated discs don't cause back pain. Arthritis doesn't cause pain. It does not correlate. When we started studying people who didn't have symptoms, we saw that though these images look like they would hurt, they're not the cause. And so that alone was huge, especially coming from a really renowned medical doctor. And I was like, well, okay, then what's going on? Why is society missing this? And he described all of that too. The defense mechanisms that we have against seeing this, or the fact that we have these in vogue symptoms where it's like, carpal tunnel syndrome was like the it syndrome. It was the it syndrome because we were thinking, okay, we're sitting at computers typing all day. But he made the point. Where was this happening before with typewriters? It wasn't. So what I realized all of a sudden, and this was a massive mind shift in general, which is, oh my God, I've been assuming certain things are right all along. I need to take a look at everything. I need to start thinking critically about this instead of just accepting what I've been told. And another thing that changed in reading the book is he said, the people who get better from this are the people who accept the diagnosis, who accept that it really is mind-body. And that's what initially led me to the concept of doubt. You can't have doubt about this. Well, I should say this. You can have doubt about it, and everybody does. But you've got to get to a place where you're certain about it with science and logic. And ultimately, I found a system to walk people through what they need to do. So what I first discovered was, all right, Sarno's talking about the fact that these structural things don't add up. You need to be certain about the diagnosis. And then the other thing that he talked about is emotional life plays a huge component in what happens with these symptoms. So I started just looking at it based on my own experience. And what I found is, even though the mind-body community talks about emotions as the kind of driving factor of mind-body symptoms, they're not always the driving factor. They are the driving factor in when it starts. And what I started to, the onsets and upticks, what I started to notice in myself, I just started doing like a study of myself with this information, is that the emotions did describe when symptoms would suddenly go up or when they would suddenly come on. But it still wasn't explaining, why did I have 8 years of back pain? Was it the same emotion for 8 years? No.
Yeah.
And I was also acutely aware of the fact that I was having all kinds of thoughts that were very fear-based. And based on what Sarno said, I knew that wouldn't be helpful. You know, you've got to come to feel safe. So I started to realize it's not just your emotions, it's also your thinking. And as I started looking at these two ideas, I noticed the ups and downs were emotional. The steady state, being seemingly stuck, the seemingly chronic, that was all about what I was thinking, because my thinking never changed. They basically never changed, and I had no reason for it to change. So I already had the two columns, the emotions column and doubt column, were starting to build there. I could see how I needed to do something with the emotional life to stop these onsets and upticks and be able to adjust things, and I was already finding some control over them. And then I found that if I changed my thinking, which is what happened when I read Sarno, let me actually jump into that, because I started reading Sarno, and there were still some questions that I had, but I went and tried to get those answers. I talked with a therapist who trained with Dr. Sarno, and I asked him like 200 questions in one session.
Right.
And that was the basis of the doubt column, because once he answered those questions, I was so much more certain that I was going to be fine. And then I started to get better. And when it really clicked, when I read the second Sarno book, so I was getting better, and I had gotten into a point where during the day I really wasn't having much pain, though I was still having spasms at night and things like that. But when it really clicked, 3 days later I was doing backflips in the pool.
Nice.
After 8 years of back pain where I felt like I was like a rusted version of the Tin Man. I mean, could barely move. It was really hard.
Right. And I just want to pause here and say, when I'm telling people, I tell people your story, and you had back pain for 8 years, and after 2 months you were completely fine and doing backflips in the swimming pool and playing basketball. They're like, what? They're in disbelief. And when you told me in the beginning, because when we first met, I had back pain for 2 years, and you told me you can potentially heal it in 2 months. And I was like, well, that sounds like a stretch, but I actually did. So just for the listeners, it sounds unbelievable. It's okay to be in disbelief when you hear this for the first time.
Not only that, but it makes sense that you would be. I mean, I was extremely skeptical. When I first got Sarno's book, I left it on a shelf for 11 months. I was like, there's no way.
Yeah.
You know, but the key here is to try to be open to it. That's one. Second, remember, everything I'm going to tell you is based on science and logic. And this is not woo-woo stuff. And then thirdly, if you just start to think about it, it makes perfect sense. We have a mind-body response all the time. That's what crying is. You feel sad or maybe sometimes happy, and actual tears roll down your face. Or you get embarrassed and your blood flow changes to your face. Or I point this out all the time. It's a bit of an indelicate topic, but you know, erections are a mind-body experience. It's you're turned on by an idea of a person or a vision. It's not because somebody came and rubbed up on you. That's not why it happens. The same is true with female arousal. Changes in the body happen all the time. Now, here's another way of thinking about it. Your whole face is a mind-body experience. It's constantly changing. This is why you can tell a fake smile from a real smile, because the feeling underneath it is not expressing the same thing.
True.
So we're having mind-body experiences all the time. When I started looking at this, once I was open to the idea and looked at it from a scientific and logical standpoint, then I started looking at it and I was like, oh my God, not only is it true, it's obvious. And then it's, you know, a huge breakthrough. So I'll jump back to the columns though and how they built. Because I understood the emotional side, and I understood how incredibly important doubt was. It was really when doubt cracked that I broke the seeming chronicity of it. But then after that, I had this experience of feeling so much more powerful than I had ever felt before. This is where the power column came from. As I started thinking to myself, wow, I was really not feeling powerful before, and now I feel like I know something that almost nobody knows, and I can do things that other people can't do, and I've been through a really important experience, and it just changed my relationship with me. And I
Right.
started looking at that, and I realized I was like, we don't have to wait for this to happen. You don't have to wait for 8 years of back pain and then recovering. Why
Yeah.
wait? Let's go straight for it. Let's understand what are the emotions doing? What is the thinking doing in the doubt column? What is your relationship with yourself like in the power column? And these are called columns, by the way, because when I first started out working with people, I would have people divide a sheet of paper into 3 columns to organize
Yeah.
these 3 ways to understand symptoms and life. And I was incredibly pleased to find that this system that I was developing, I guess the way that I would best describe it is it felt to me like it just was a very accurate depiction and description of how people actually are. It was just like I was just describing what I was seeing in me based on these observations, and then I found they apply to everybody.
Right. I find it fascinating that we are taught that the nervous system and the body, they are purely biological. So the nervous system is there for survival. But after going through my journey of healing my back pain and studying your material, now I understand that the nervous system is not just for survival. It actually wants me to be happy, to feel good, to feel powerful, and to achieve the things that I want to achieve in a certain way.
100%. And that's really what I found out in the power column is once I started feeling powerful. Of course, I hadn't named it the power column or anything like that, but I started feeling powerful, and I started realizing, but what is it really that I'm feeling powerful about? And it was about the fact that I was aligning with myself. I was like, and it's just what you said. I realized I was like, there is a part of me, and maybe a part of like the broader universe or something, who knows,
Yeah.
that wants me to be happy.
Right.
Like, I didn't feel that before at all.
Yeah.
But now I felt like, okay, you know what? Even this back pain wasn't just about like suffering or torture or being punished or anything. It was primarily that there was a part of me that knew I wasn't living in alignment with myself. And that's what's underneath it all. You don't usually discover the power column stuff until you've brought doubt down and learned about the emotions. But then everything flows towards power. And you start to realize this is about me needing to figure out who I am and how to radiate myself out into the universe.
That's right. That's fascinating. So, who is the book for specifically?
Great question. I mean, this is going to sound like a cop-out answer at first, but it's not. This book is for everybody, but the reason I say that is it's multifaceted. It is for sufferers to get better. That's first and foremost. It's for them. It's everything that I wished I had been able to read. If I could have read this book even before Sarno, I would have gotten even more answers, but because I had the advantage of asking these questions and getting these answers. But it's for the sufferers to get better. It's also for the people who have sufferers in their lives so that they can understand what is this person going through. Because it's a very lonely journey otherwise. And not only that, non-sufferers can cause a lot of doubt in sufferers without realizing it. Where you're getting better in certain ways, you're holding on to something, but they're like, but I don't understand. Why this? Those seemingly innocuous questions, they can knock people flat. So I want to build support around the sufferer, but it's also for doctors and therapists to learn how to do these things better and to understand what is the body actually saying.
Right.
I got more out of my symptoms and understanding them than I did out of 20 years of therapy. And I'm not saying that 20 years of therapy wasn't good. It had some really good parts to it, but I got much further in my process with me through understanding these mind-body concepts. And then lastly, it's for everyone because the way I see it, I'm sure you'll remember this from the last chapter, I see this as incredibly significant for the world. I think that all of these symptoms we're having, there's 1.5 billion chronic pain sufferers out there. That's a fifth of the world. And that's just chronic pain. There's people who aren't reporting the symptoms. There are people who are having other symptoms. If you really look at it, well, how many people are having symptoms that they wish they could control? It's got to be over 95% of the world, I would think.
Yeah.
And so we have to change as a society, not just to get relief from all of these problems, but I also
Yeah.
think that the body is, and the wisdom of the body is guiding us towards better living. So I talk about in the end of my book something that I call core mind-body values. And essentially that's, I don't like to use the word should because I'm not judging things or telling people what they should do, but the body knows what's good for us and it knows what's good for other people. And so if we engage in toxic relationships or we fight all the time and leave lots of toxicity between people, what I found from all the studies is that's actually bad for physical health. Like we're killing each other with this stuff. And so this book is also just a call to action to everybody to understand these mind-body concepts and their implications so that we can start to live in better self-aligned ways that build up everybody's power.
Right. So that is really cool. In my network, let's say, I notice people who complain about having nerve pain in their back. Oh, I have a pinched nerve. I was at a party and somebody was saying that they have, I don't know, slip discs and they had a surgery. They fused their spine. And in those situations, I try to find an appropriate way to bring up the topic. Hey, I'm about to say something that's you're not going to believe it at first, but how would you approach this and in varying intensities? If somebody had a surgery that they fused their whole spine, part of it is now structural, but it is potential that the mind body is included within that journey too.
It's a great question. And I have this discussion in my head every day because I'm always talking to people about this, and different people are at different places in their willingness to accept this. What I like to encourage people is, look, I'm not forcing you to think anything. I'm not trying to push anything on you. I just had an experience and I have information. And if you can just be open enough to it to hear me out, you're going to be blown away by this. And so first I just open up space. It's similar to what you said, but we got to gauge, where is this person? How open are they to it? There are times where people are like, no, I'm not going there. And then they'll come back to me later sometimes. Or maybe they won't at all, but at least I'm willing to offer it. And if I can just ask them to just be open to hearing about these ideas, and I tell them it's all scientific and logical. It is. This is supported in medical journals, which it is. I find most of them are open to it. And here's the other thing, Hussam. Sometimes you're going to find people are closed off to it, but you put the idea in their head, and then they're wandering around in life, and they're thinking, I had a pain, and suddenly they're like, wait a minute, I did just have that pain right after that difficult conversation with my parents or something like that. It gets them to thinking. Now, here's another added advantage. Once they're thinking about it, sometimes the effects actually take hold in the body, and then seeing is believing. So the way I think about it is like, I'm basically trying to convince people that gravity exists. It's that basic. So what that means is if anybody's willing to look at this enough, they're going to find that I'm right. And I don't mean I'm right like this is about me. Anybody in the mind-body community who understands these things, we're right.
So this is going to be an interesting question because I know you have children. So how would you explain this to a 6-year-old? What causes the body to have symptoms? And then how would you explain the 3 columns?
Okay, so the first way that I want to answer it is this. One of the things people will probably be very surprised about is kids actually know this better than adults. They do. If you talk to a young kid, especially if they're like 4, they'll say things like, this actually happened with my nephew when he was about 4. We were having a party, I think it was for my birthday actually, and he just went in the other room and he was quietly sitting there. And I came in and I said, hey, what's going on? And he said, I just, the things people were talking about were making me not feel well. This is a 4-year-old.
Right.
So one of the things that people need to remember is we actually know this. We know this within ourselves, but it's adult society that's beating it out of us and saying it's not here. So the younger the kid, the more likely they are to understand this. They're having these experiences all the time. And here's another way of thinking about it. A lot of these symptoms, the body is expressing because they are what's called pre-verbal symptoms. They come up before the kid can even talk. So the body is our first language. The body is our first language. So that fact exists. Kids already know about it. When I'm talking to a kid about it, a lot of times I'll just kind of express the idea like, did you know that, the things that you think and feel can make you feel things and have things happen in your body? And I might describe like, that's what crying is. And I'll just start it off like there. Usually the kids take to this very easily, especially the younger the kid. But if I were to get into a conversation with a kid and they were open enough to it, but hadn't already accepted it or feel like they got that already, then the way that I would talk about the columns, I probably wouldn't talk about it in the intellectual terms or the terms of the columns, but I would just talk about feeling, thinking, and your relationship with yourself. Just the basic ideas.
Yeah.
To tell them these are the three things that really affect what goes on in your body.
Right. Cool. So I'm noticing that feeling or the emotions column and your relationship with yourself, which is the power column, they kind of have like opposite dynamics. They work in a paradox. Feeling is like being vulnerable and humble and accepting the trauma or the bad situation. And the relationship with the self or the power is like, hey, I deserve this. I earned this, or this is my space. This is my right.
Yeah, it's interesting. So here's the way I think about it. The emotions and power column are both emotional columns. They're both columns where you're dealing with the emotions, whereas doubt is you're dealing with thinking almost exclusively. The only exception being that fear is the emotional form of doubt, so it can get emotional, but it comes from thinking. So in doubt, we're dealing with thinking. In the emotions column, we're dealing with emotions, but we're only trying to become aware of them. We're not even thinking about what we're going to do about them. We're just trying to think about what emotion led to the symptom, just so you can become aware of it. If you take it out of that unconscious experience, the symptom isn't needed anymore because it was there to distract from the bad emotional experience. If you make that conscious, that's not needed anymore. In the doubt column, the function of the symptom is to protect. And if you convince yourself you're safe, truly, that symptom's not needed anymore. And the seemingly chronic breaks up too. The power column, I was thinking about the way you asked the question, and the way that I would think about this is that the power column is actually where you deal with that paradox. Because the first part of the power column is really letting in the fullness of the trauma, really experiencing it, and people can feel crushed. I mean, the words crushing doubt, they have a double meaning, because you can be crushed by them, and then eventually you turn it on its head and you crush it. The power column is a perfect dichotomy of that. You first experience and recognize how was I crushed? And then you start to look at, now, how can I take up my space? How can I be different here? In fact, there's something in the power column that I call the core narrative, where you build out a story of the main way that you've suffered. And the first two sentences outline the first half of the paradox. How were you crushed? And the third sentence outlines how you're going to crush it.
Right. So we must allow ourselves to be crushed by it first. This way we can crush it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's similar to what you said, but I would say we have to recognize that we were crushed by it. It's not, you're going to feel crushed in the moment, but it's more that you're recognizing that you already were.
Right. What would you say to someone who maybe has resistance to accepting, I wasn't, like they say to themselves, I wasn't crushed that bad. It wasn't a big deal.
Yeah. Multiple things I could say about it, and it probably go different ways with different people. But one of the first things that I say is that I have never talked to anybody with power column work, nobody, who doesn't downplay what happened to them. Everybody downplays what happens to them because we don't want to see it. It's incredibly painful.
Yeah.
But power column work allows you to see this incredibly painful material once and for all and be totally certain about it. And it usually takes a couple months of sitting with that, which is not all agony, but there's a lot of it. It's a mourning process.
Yeah.
And then once you're past it, you're past it. You know, when I did this, I recognized that not having a father growing up of my own, I did have my dad now. He adopted us, but he wasn't like a full dad for a long time. And it left me feeling not valid in a lot of ways. But I didn't know that. It was only once I started recognizing my power and I had this experience of looking back on everything that I was like,
Yeah.
oh my God, I had been crushed in that way. And I
Yeah.
let it in and I
Mhm.
felt it. And I used to look for father figures all the time to try to solve this dilemma I was having with myself, these bad feelings. Since I got into power, do you know how many times I've looked for a father figure to help me?
I would say zero or
Zero
close to
times.
zero.
Zero. I don't, and it's not through willpower. I don't even need to anymore. It's like I'm my own father.
You are your own
I
father?
don't need anything else.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So you talk about things like violence packaged as care and something like aggressive power grabs and putting the blame where it belongs and setting boundaries. Can you talk about those a little bit and how you would dip into what you also call black and white thinking?
Yeah. So these are great examples of that second half of the paradox, where you're going to start to take up your space. You're going to start to live in a way that is aligned with yourself. It doesn't even have to happen all that much outside of yourself. A lot of it can just be inside you. So I'm not advocating for people like going on the warpath and starting to be very difficult with other people.
Yeah.
Just the opposite. It's that you're not going to let difficult people dominate you or put you in a bad position, knock you out of power. So let's go over some of those terms you talked about. I'll start with dipping into black and white thinking. In psychology, there's a often very helpful idea of recognizing the shades of gray. That, okay, if we're thinking really darkly about something or we're idealizing something, we got to get somewhere in the middle to get more of a reality. Well, this is another paradox here, because within power, there's a reason I say dip into black and white thinking. I'm not saying become a black and white thinker, but you've got to be able sometimes to be certain about something. You need to get the shades of gray out of your head. So if there's somebody who you love who abused you, I'm not saying not to love them anymore, but you can dip into the experience of when they abused me, that was 100% harmful. It wasn't 80% harmful, but I love them. 80% harmful, but you love them. Maybe that's even true, but it's not helpful. What's going to help in the moment is 100% harmful. Don't need to love them right now. No.
Right.
Because ultimately we're trying to access what's deep inside and have different moments where we can start to shift things. Because we're all moment to moment beings. So I'm not advocating being in one place at any time. But you need to know how to get yourself unhooked from certain moments. And if you're not letting in the fullness of what happened to you, you need a way in.
Yeah.
That black and white thinking, that can do it. Recognizing something like violence packages care. These are all points of clarity. Violence packages care. What that means is there's going to be a lot of people who come to you and the words they're saying sound like they're caring, but really they're meant to tear you down. And I know it's ugly, but it can happen. Or people can, aggressive power grabs is another thing you mentioned. Well, that's where people might either see that you're in power and want to tear you down, or they might be feeling bad about themselves in some way and want to build themselves up by climbing on top of you. And so it's like we're finding ways to look at the ugly side of life, see it clearly, so we can know what to do about it in a given moment and then get on with our day. And then we can get back to shades of gray and good thinking and all that other stuff. But we've got to be able to dip into all this stuff.
That's right. That's right. You talk about the core narrative, and when I learned about that, I loved the idea and I embraced it. And when I try to explain it to someone, I tell them, hey, what is your favorite superhero? Like whatever, Batman. Okay, so Batman, he has a core narrative. He accepted the fullness of his trauma, and that's why he decided to do what he does. And each of us, we need to have that core narrative as well. How would you describe the core narrative and why is it important?
Well, I love that you brought up superheroes there because it made me realize the core narrative is basically an origin story. You know, it's just like that with all superheroes. So the way that I would describe the core narrative is we've all got tons of different aspects of our identity. You know, all the happy parts. That's great. That's real. But the core narrative is where we dip into some black and white thinking and we just think about, but how did we suffer only? What's the suffering story? It's the Cinderella story, you know.
Yeah.
What were the ways that you were made to suffer? And what went wrong? And how did it affect you? And it allows people to focus in on accepting the fullness of their trauma. And when I say that, the key word is fullness.
Yeah.
Most people accept their trauma. They know what happened to them, but they don't know how far it went. They don't know how bad it was for them. And they tend to downplay it, just like we were talking about. So telling this story to ourselves and being able to screen out all the good stuff. I'm not trying to get all dark all the time, but we need to be able to, in a targeted way, get in there and see what happened to us so we can really feel that and mourn it. And so it's the way that we tell ourselves this story so we can see clearly, probably for the first time, what happened to us? How did it hurt? And that opens the door then to what are we going to do about it? You can't do something about a problem you won't admit.
Yeah.
But if you admit the fullness of that problem, then you can do something about it. So here's one thing that I decided based on my core narrative experience. I had many situations where I had been knocked out of power or not treated well. And I decided that even though this would just be a goal that I probably wouldn't be able to meet all the time, that my goal would be I'm never going to betray myself again. And, you know, maybe in some minor ways it can happen from time to time, but if so, I correct it. You know, it's like there are these new directives that we give to ourselves about how we're going to live. And I really I've changed my life. They're like little mantras that I tell myself about. No, don't give away your power. Stay fiercely in your own corner. Stay aligned with yourself. Do what you need to do. Trust your instincts. All this stuff.
Right. And it's amazing because these mantras that you share in the videos, they become in my mind too. So I repeat them to myself and they help me a lot.
Mm-hmm. So those sayings, there's something that I call action steps. Action steps are new ways of thinking that open up space for all kinds of different experience. And so I think that's what you're saying, Hassam, is these action steps, they stick with you. They become part of how you can work. And by the way, in the book, I have 3 chapters on action steps, and I put in bold what those sayings are so that people can kind of just flip through and be like, oh yeah, frustration is a form of doubt. Yeah, I got the book right here, so I'm looking. Oh, you don't need to change who you are at all. Okay. These are all ideas that open up space for something.
Yes. I love how they're bolded because someone like me, if I see a lot of text, sometimes it gets difficult for me. Usually when I read books, I highlight and then I reread the book later and I read only the things that I highlighted. So you already did that for me, which I found to be amazing. All right. So how do we navigate the fine line between accepting the fullness of our trauma and what some people call re-traumatizing ourselves?
Beautiful question. So the way that I think about this is that the goal isn't to wallow in the trauma. The goal isn't to feel sorry for ourselves. The goal is to feel empathy for ourselves. There's that is the fine line right there, because it is not about the fact that we are now going to sit in this. You re-traumatize yourself when you sit in it. When you feel like, well, I just opened up all this horrible stuff and I'm just going to sit in it and feel it again. I guess the way I would describe it, Hassam, this is probably the best way of saying it, is we are re-experiencing it, but this time with purpose. It's not just to re-experience it. It's to re-experience it for purposes of understanding and putting it in the past. You can let go of it once you've mourned it. But if you don't accept the fullness of it, you don't get to mourn it. So fullness, again, is the key word. Because if you don't go the whole way, you don't get to mourn it. And if you go the whole
Right.
way with the goal being just to feel bad, that doesn't help either. The goal has to
Yeah.
be, we're feeling bad in a targeted way to mourn
Mm,
so that we
right.
can then leave it behind.
That's right. Makes sense. So when we speak about the emotions column, so the emotion column and the power column, it's to empower us. And when we speak about the doubt, it can be confusing because it's trying to disempower us and distract us, but at the same time, it's trying to empower us depending how we want to perceive it. And you mentioned something that usually when somebody's recovering from mind-body symptoms, the symptoms can be tricky and they can appear in other areas. So I noticed when I was healing my low back, my wrist started hurting. And if it wasn't for me knowing what you described, I'd be like, whoa, my body's just falling apart. But I knew that it was doubt. And just by knowing, I think it was under control.
It's huge because otherwise it'll just dance to a new part and then you'll be focused on that and you'll be wondering what's wrong with me physically. So then you'd be like,
Yeah.
well, okay, no, I guess I have tendonitis or I have an injury or I have carpal tunnel or whatever.
Hmm.
And suddenly another spot where it can hide for good if it stays outside of the realm of doubt. As you noted, if you know it's just doubt, you follow the shifts and you don't worry about where it is. You instead see it all as the same thing. It's all doubt that your body's falling apart and that we've got all these structural issues when really we don't.
Right. Do we have a biological explanation of the doubt or a location of it, where it comes from?
When you say location, do you mean like within the body
Like,
or brain or
right.
okay?
Yeah.
So I'll give you my explanation, though. These are all just ideas that we're exploring. And I have a joke about the book that the longer I took to write it, the better it got because I
Right.
got more and more answers. So hopefully this
Hmm.
answer will be one of those good ones that came out of all that time that I sat with it.
Yeah.
I would say that it comes from multiple sources. One is evolutionary.
Mm.
We are, there needs to be a part of our brain that doubts. It has to be because otherwise we will not, we won't protect ourselves from danger. So it's built in that there needs to be some form of doubt. But then what
Mm.
happens when it goes too far? That's when we start to get into problems. So
Mm.
from that perspective, what it is in the brain is essentially the parts of the brain that are processing danger, usually like the more primitive brain, like the brainstem and all that. They don't there's no deeper thinking about it. So there's no difference in the brain between being chased by a lion and approaching a potential love interest that you're really nervous about. There's no difference.
Mm.
Your heart might be hammering. You could feel like you're about to die.
Right.
So I would say where it's located is in this evolutionary primitive brain. There's this
Mm.
sense of danger and needing to protect. What we can do, though, in working with doubt, is we can take the cerebral cortex, the part of our brain that can think more deeply, and walk ourselves through it. This is not a lion. This is just a girl I want to ask out.
Right.
Nothing bad is going to happen. We can walk ourselves through that.
Right.
And but it's all about fear. It's all about fear and the evolutionary need to protect ourselves that can get very awry, especially in today's day and age.
Right. Right. That makes sense. So I have this question, and I'm not sure exactly if, let's see, is there a difference between fear from the trauma and fear from the doubt?
Fear from the trauma versus fear from the doubt?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Here's my first
Yeah.
attempt at answering it, but we may
Yeah.
need to look at this one more. So
Yeah.
I would say that, fear of trauma, it comes from being in situations that remind you of the trauma or have some similarities to it. And that's very understandable that people would have that. Now, power column work can get us to a place where we feel safe even from that. But doubt
Mm.
is more expansive. Doubt goes everywhere. And so,
Yeah.
doubt, I guess I would say it this way: fear of trauma is pretty rational. You had that
Mm.
experience, you're seeing signs that it's headed for a similar place. You don't want that.
Mm-hmm.
Fear that comes from doubt although fear is a form of doubt, but fear that can come up from those doubt-related thinking, it can go anywhere. You can be afraid of anything. Here's a good example of it. I was running a group today, and I was talking with a guy who was saying that he's gotten his doubt down about structural issues. He knows he's only got mind-body stuff, but now doubt pounced on this. If I have to control my mind to control this, what if I can't do it? And he was saying, I became afraid of my own mind.
Yeah.
So fears in the doubt form, they can go into any crack. I have a metaphor that I sometimes use that I actually got from a patient I once worked with. Doubt is like water. If you pour it on the ground, it will go into any crack there is. Doubt will go anywhere, whereas fear of trauma is very specific to mirroring what you experience. Fear of doubt can go anywhere. You could start to doubt about things that have nothing to do with your traumas of the past.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered your question, but that's a good
start.
That
makes a lot of sense. Okay, so it's important to ask questions to get doubt down. Are there good questions and bad questions?
That's a great question right there. So, yes. Well, I'll say it this way. There's actually no bad questions if they're actual questions. But there's something in my book that I talk about A questions and B questions, which I named just to delineate these two types of questions. A questions are designed to ask the questions that if you could get the answers, they'd make you feel safer, better, more clear about what's happening. Those are great questions. There's still a form of doubt because you don't know what's happening, but I call that the gold standard of doubt. That's how we want to work in doubt, is to ask these A questions. If I got that answer, I'd be further along. Then there's B questions. B questions aren't really questions. They are stated as questions, but they're not trying to get an answer. In fact, they already think they know the answer. So I'll give you an example. You could ask the same question two different ways. You could ask the question, why am I going to get better? So as an A question, you're asking, can you help me understand why I can know that I am going to get better? That's going after the information. But a B question, exact same question, why am I going to get better? Did you hear the way I asked it?
Right.
It was asked with fear. It's asked with an assumption that you're not going to get better.
It's asked with an assumption.
So it's not really asking a question. It's actually a statement. You could translate that second question, I'll put in quotes, into a statement, I don't believe I'm going to get better. Right. So it's just a statement of doubt. Real questions are always good because they're information you need. But a lot of times people ask questions that aren't really questions.
That's right. Real questions. I like that. Okay, in the beginning of the book, you start with a quote from Arthur Schupenhour. All truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And third, it is accepted as self-evident. For our viewers, what is that truth that we're talking about, and how is it ridiculed, violently opposed, and hopefully accepted as self-evident?
Okay, so what Schopenhauer is talking about could be applied to any particular truth. It once was applied to Copernicus's idea that the Earth revolved around the sun, not the other way around. That was once ridiculed and violently opposed and then accepted. And then it had to happen again with Kepler, that it wasn't circular orbits, it was elliptical. We go through this over and over and over. And in many different ways. In medicine, in philosophy, in life. It can be about anything. Like people could say, well, the truth is that people could argue social media is bad for us, it's good for us, it's both. But, we got to really look at actual ideas. And what Schopenhauer, I think, is talking about, and the reason that quote jumped out at me, is it's so important to recognize that if we're not thinking critically, we're going to fall right into that pattern. We're going to just ridicule. And we're going to stay in the ridiculing phase. And obviously the truth we're talking about here is, do mind-body symptoms cause a wide range of symptoms? And they do. I say if the body can do it, the mind can use it. It doesn't matter what it is, head to toe. These ideas, sometimes they're being ridiculed. Sometimes they're being violently opposed. But they're not yet being accepted as completely self-evident. For me, they're totally self-evident. For you, they're totally self-evident. We've crossed over to that point.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like, well, where is everybody in this Schopenhauer line? Are you ridiculing
Right.
it? Are you violently opposing it? Or have
Mm-hmm.
you accepted it? And
Right.
underneath all of it is, it's not going to get accepted if it's not true.
Yeah.
It will be rejected.
Mm-hmm. And for me, I can say I resisted it before.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I
Right.
think you were open to it when we first started these discussions. You weren't ridiculing
Mm-hmm.
it,
Right.
but you were resisting it, which is very natural.
Mm-hmm. Because before we spoke about it, it was brought up to me like maybe twice that the pain in my back is from my mind. I was like, come on. No, my mind is fine. It was almost like I was half offended.
Right. Well, actually, and if you think about it, one of the reasons that people get offended by that is that they think that that means that you're making it up. But these are not made up symptoms. They're very real in the body. And the line that I
Yeah.
use is, they're not in your head. They're from your
Yeah.
head. And then they
Yeah.
become real in the body.
That's right.
Well, I was told about this once also before, but it was presented to me as if it was in my head. And I was like, well, I'm not going to accept that. That makes me sound like a head case. Something's wrong with
Right.
me.
That's right.
Whereas really, it's just the human condition.
Yeah, makes sense. So I want to say that what I really love about the work that you do is that it's a philosophy, but it's not only grounded in logic, it's grounded in our biology. So I think it makes it really unique. And for me specifically, this is going to be one of the books that I come back to, I would say, throughout my life, because it's like decoding the messages from the body to guide my life.
Yeah.
So it's not some philosophy that somebody thought about in Greece or Rome or something. Oh, it's a philosophy that the body, the biology is saying.
Mm-hmm.
So I really love that.
Thank you for saying
Ah,
that. I will say, though, in Greece and Rome and throughout history, as you read in the book, we did have these ideas. What I like about what I'm doing in this, well, one of the things that I like about what I did in this book is to organize it in an up-to-date way about, well, how do you use this? But I agree with you. This is a philosophy. Like, it's my way of living, is these columns.
right. Yeah. A hypothetical question. If you were the president of the earth, what adjustment would you make to make the world 5% better?
Oh, wow. Wow. I've never had so much power. Thank you, Hussam. I mean, this is going to sound very trite, but it's really my answer. I would want everybody to read and understand this book. And the reason I say that is because of that 10th chapter. What are the significance and implications? Once you see this, you can't live in certain ways. Like, I would say we'd get to much more than 5% better if everybody were living by core mind-body values, where they recognize the other person's physical health depends on their happiness. I say happiness is health. There's studies that show that for people who have even just one good friend versus those who don't, the ones who don't, that's worse for you than smoking for your physical health. Or there's the adverse childhood experiences study, which shows that kids who have experienced things like substance abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, all kinds of things in the home, death of a parent, they are actually more likely, and this is a scientific study with over 17,000 participants, they are more likely to develop heart disease, cancer, diabetes. Like, we're going to get much more than 5% better if we recognize these things.
Right.
Not only in terms of saving people's physical health, but also in terms of how we treat each other and how we treat ourselves. Like, all that savagery we bring to ourselves is toxic.
Yeah.
People die from it.
That's right. That's right. Where can people find you, find your book, and any other services that you offer?
Okay, so the best resource is my website, which is www.crushingdoubt.com. If you want to order the book, by the way, you can go to www.crushingdoubtbook.com. It'll take you right to the order form for that. But on my website are all of my resources, and those include the book. I also have these teaching seminars, which you watched, Hussam. That was actually one of the primary ways that you use this to get better from the back pain. I
want to say that within 3 hours of watching this seminar, my back pain was lowered, I would say, by like 80%.
Isn't that amazing?
I was actually sitting down while I was studying the seminar.
Mhm.
And at that period of my life, I was not sitting down. I was doing everything standing up.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Listen, this is how powerful that information is, which is why when you ask me what would I do to change the world, it's this. I want everybody to know this and just finally for us to all be on the same page. It would allow people to live more authentically. So back to the resources. The seminar teach about all of mind body experience. Why does one person say this and another person says this? It's an integrative model of how to understand the mind body process. And then it brings down doubt. It goes through all these different aspects of why you can believe this is true. And then it introduces my system. So the seminar is on the website. What I found, though, is that the first time I did this seminar, the response was great. People loved it. But then in the weeks that followed, I could tell they needed more support. They needed more interaction with me. So I have membership groups also available on the website where people can come to meet with me in a group setting as a Zoom call once, twice, or 3 times a week, where we can practice this. So you learn about it, but then you can keep learning about it and putting it in practice with me with the membership groups. So the book, the seminars, and the membership groups are the main ways that you can interact with me. And there's a contact us form on the website, though you can also just email me, dan@crushingdoubt.com.
Perfect. I'll link those things in the description as well. Dan, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing the knowledge and the love. And I'm looking forward to having more helpful conversations like that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hassam. I appreciate your appreciation of the book, my work, me, and our relationship. You know, this is part of that good living. Like, I collect people like you to be in my life because we build each other up. We want the best for each other. So thanks
That's
for
right.
being here.